which is part of the discovery in this matter. It's the serology and DNA report from Brian Good. I want to go through that. with you all. So the first scene is Priya's car, her Hyundai. No DNA, no fingerprints associated with Gregory Robinson anywhere in or around that car. And specifically, according to State's Exhibit 138, there was a cigarette butt collected. There were swabs of the exterior front driver's door handle, swabs of the exterior front passenger door handle, swabs of the exterior rear driver's side door handle, swabs of the exterior rear passenger side door handle, and a steering wheel cover. All of those things were submitted, and none of them had any fingerprints or DNA belonging to Gregory Robinson. The second scene of importance in this particular case is the garage at Poinsett Drive. Ms. Witt testified that Anton's body was stored in that garage for a period of time on that evening, the 18th into the 19th. There was no DNA found. None of Anton's DNA was found at that scene. None of Anton's blood was found at that scene. We don't know if police looked for that or not. We didn't hear testimony on that. There's no DNA or blood at that scene linking the Poinsett Drive garage to this case. The third scene of importance is Jamie Klein's house on Hartzell Road in New Haven. And you heard the testimony from the folks that collected the swabs, and you heard testimony from the individuals who tested the swabs. There were a lot of swabs, and pieces of evidence taken from that scene. There was an oven mitt. Gregory's DNA was not on the oven mitt. There were 3 swabs taken from the patio. Gregory's DNA was not in any of those 3 swabs. The OtterBox phone case, again, Gregory's DNA was not found. The knife collected from the right chest of Jamie Klein, they tested that in multiple locations. Gregory's DNA was not on that knife. Red stains from Jamie Klein's left foot, not Gregory's DNA. Swabs from the floor tile. There were multiple swabs collected from floor tile. That DNA was not Gregory's. It was Reginald Gann's. Swabs from the zippers of the living room pouch. None of Gregory's DNA. Jamie Klein's left. The fingernail clippings from her left hand. None of Gregory's DNA. Same for the right hand. Same for the hairs found in the left hand. Same for the hairs found in the right hand. None of Gregory's DNA is in this paperwork at all. All of these pieces of evidence that were submitted, all of this evidence, all of this, tested. Not a drop of Gregory Robinson's DNA was found at any of these scenes. The fourth scene was the location where Anton's body was found. And the police submitted the trash bag for testing. Of course, none of Gregory's DNA or fingerprints were found on that trash bag or at that scene. Not a drop of Gregory Robinson's DNA anywhere at these scenes. I want to talk about Dr. Wagner's testimony. He's obviously very smart, well-educated. He's been doing this a long time. He painted us a picture of what happened at the Hartzell Road address. He said specifically, and I think this was as a result of a juror question, there were no injuries conclusive to her being restrained regarding Jamie. No injuries conclusive to her being restrained. Dr. Wagner states expert witness testified to that. He also testified that he didn't know how many knives were used. With objects like knives, you can't necessarily tell how many or the difference in the knives. He did discuss, obviously, the serration leaves different marks at times, but he didn't know how many knives were involved. It could be one, it could be more than one. He doesn't know. And he also testified, which I think is really important, he testified that perpetrators who are inflicting stab wounds on someone oftentimes injure themselves. And that makes sense, right? Because a kitchen knife doesn't have a hand protector like a sword or something, where a sword is intended to be used in battle, for instance. A kitchen knife doesn't have that protector, so it was not intended for that use. So the hilt isn't very large, so it's not stopping the user's hand from touching the blade. So oftentimes, we've heard this from other folks that testified, oftentimes during stabbing injuries, the perpetrator is also injured. You heard testimony from Dr. Wagner about the brutal nature of Jamie's injuries. She said that there was he said that there was blunt force trauma. And that was evidenced by her missing tooth. One of her teeth were completely knocked out. The other tooth was chipped or broken. And she had contusions and injuries to her face. All signs of blunt force trauma. That is a different picture than what Priya Witt painted for us. The cell phone data, you heard some information about that. Back in 2016, 2017, police were able to obtain cell phone records of both victims. So they had Anton Moore's phone records and they had Jamie Klein's phone records. Detective Kruger testified that by the time 2023 rolled around and Gregory's name is brought up into the investigation, too much time had passed to be able to get that cell phone record data. However, we have the victims' phones. The police could look in the victims' phones and see who they were contacting. In fact, they did contact those folks. And there's nothing in that data that has anything to do with Gregory Robinson. And obviously, there was no surveillance footage of any of these incidents. Nothing that puts Gregory Robinson at the scene. There was no surveillance from any fire station, from any house, from any ring doorbell, any apartment complex surveillance. There was nothing. There was no surveillance at all putting Gregory Robinson in any of these locations. Our only link is Priya Witt. Priya Witt's testimony is the only thing to implicate Gregory Robinson. And you have the benefit of hearing her testimony in her story 3 times. Once while she was live in court testifying, and you heard both of her proffers. And I want to talk about the inconsistencies in those statements shortly. But she's lying. She's lying to save herself. She's lying so that she doesn't have to spend the rest of her life in prison. If she didn't testify this week that Gregory Robinson stabbed Jamie Klein and helped to dispose of Anton Moore's body, she's going to prison for the rest of her life. How can we possibly trust her? Jawan didn't. He told you multiple times. She told me about the story, but I didn't believe her. She's a drug addict, she's an alcoholic. I didn't believe her. He knows her far better than we do, and he didn't believe her. Priya Witt talked to police in 2016 on at least one occasion, Sounds like likely more occasions. Again in 2017. So 2016, she knows nothing about these homicides, nothing about why her car would be caught on fire. She has no information to provide to police in 2016. 2017, same thing. No information on these homicides. Fast forward 7 years. She's charged with a double murder. Suddenly she has a story to tell. Regarding her inconsistent statements, I want you to think about what she said regarding why she didn't come forward to the police. She said she was scared, she was terrified. She used a variety of different words for us. Those are the reasons why she did not come forward to the police and tell them what happened. She testified that she took Gregory and Reginald to Chicago on the day of the murder, or the evening, unsure of the timeline there, but at some point right, in the 19th into the 20th, she drops Gregory Robinson and Reginald Gant off in Chicago. The police call her on her way back. She said she was traveling on 30, traveling back to Fort Wayne from Chicago. She could have mentioned it then. She knows these two guys are in Chicago. She's so worried about them. They're in Chicago. She's dropped them off. Why don't you go directly to the police station when you get back to Fort Wayne and tell them what happened? There's no concern for her safety at that point. They're in Chicago. How does that make sense? But instead of going directly to the police station, where does she go? Directly to Reggie's house, where she stayed for an entire another year. How does that make sense? If she is terrified of these guys, why is she living at Reggie's house again for an entire year after these incidents took place? How does that make sense? She said that she was, having a hard time. But think about that. There are shelters to go to. There are certainly other places to go to than the people that you're absolutely terrified of. That just doesn't make sense. And during the course of her testimony, Ms. Witt mentioned and kind of made a big deal about the fact that she's a mother and that she was doing all she could to protect this little girl. But this is what that little girl was left to see in the morning. How is that protecting her? She gets to see her mother like this. How is that protecting her? That is not. Ms. Witt also testified that Ms. Klein did not fight back because she was too weak. But we know that's not correct, based on the expert witnesses that the state of Indiana called. She had defensive wounds to her hands. She had injuries to her face. One of the responding officers testified that there was a severe struggle based on the scene that he saw. So we know that that is not correct, based on the science. And there was a point in time where Mr. Shaley asked Ms. Witt whether or not Anton Moore and Reginald Gant were engaged in drug dealing operations. And she said she didn't know about that. That's what she testified to. She didn't know about that. She didn't know whether or not they were involved in drug trade or not. But then you got to see her proffer. Both of them. During one of the proffers, I think it was the first one, she said, quote, "They sell drugs, that's all I know." And then she said that she took them to the strip club to make runs or plays, which means to sell drugs. Priya lived with Reggie. Priya was a drug addict. Reggie was a drug dealer. Of course she knew. Of course she knew that they were dealing drugs. Why would she lie? She just lied. She lied on the stand. Why would she lie? Because that's what she's doing. That's what she does. I don't know if you caught this I think it was the first proffer. Detective Sept said something towards the end about, hey, do you remember talking to me at some point during the course of this investigation back in 2016, and you told me that Reggie had your car? And she said, no, I don't remember that, or something to that effect. He goes, well, no, I know you did, because it's on video. So she's telling them one story at that point. All she's doing is telling a variety of different stories to suit her needs in the moment that she tells them. Regarding Proffer 1 versus Proffer 2, there is an entirely different person added to the mix on Proffer 2. Does that make sense to you? It is your job to judge the credibility of witnesses. Does that make sense that she would completely forget one person who's there? I want to talk about the difference in testimony based on what Priya Witt said versus what Jawan Collins says. Priya told you during her testimony that she contacted Jawan, that she called him, and he said, hey, come to the big house at a certain time. You heard from Jawan. He said, no, she didn't call me. She showed up there. That's inconsistency. What about the headrest? I think this was another juror question. If Priya didn't know anything about the headrest, then how did Jawan? So Priya testified that the headrests were intact when she last saw her vehicle. That's not the case according to Jawan, because Jawan says that Priya drove her Hyundai Sonata to the big house on the day of the incident, and he saw with his own 2 eyes that those headrests were missing. So how does Priya not know that they're missing? She's the one that's driving the car. They weren't removed after she went to Chicago. Jawan said that he saw that. And that was before the trip to Chicago. Another inconsistency. At one point, Mr. Shaley asked Ms. Witt, did Jawan have any contact with the defendant when you were with him? Her answer was no. No, Jawan and the defendant did not have any contact while I was with them. Her proffer, she says that she didn't know that Jawan and Greg spoke at all. That in fact, she said, I had no clue until I read it in the affidavit. Meaning that this information was in the probable cause affidavit that was part of the discovery in her case. That is different than what Jawan said. Priya's saying, no, I have no knowledge of those two communicating at all. Jawan says that Gregory and Priya show up to the big house. Priya was there originally, left, came back 30 minutes later with Greg. And that's when he was threatened and made these admissions in person. Priya doesn't remember that. She said it didn't happen. Jawan said there was a phone call where he believed that Priya was speaking with Gregory. Priya doesn't remember that. That didn't happen. Those are inconsistencies. And Jawan may not be the most reliable source of information as well, because he does have a conviction for a crime of dishonesty. He is a convicted thief. He was convicted of conversion in 2021. So take that into account when you're determining his credibility. And I understand that these things are little. They may not seem consequential, but they are. They are the only thing. Their word, the word of Jawan Collins, and the word of Priya Witt are the only thing that's putting Gregory in that chair. They're the only thing having him face these charges. So their word is important. We need to dissect it. We need to determine the credibility of that witness. I want to talk about jury instructions a little bit. Judge Sent is going to read you some instructions here shortly, but there are a couple that I would like to point out as particularly important in this case. Under the law of the state, a person charged with a crime is presumed to be innocent. This presumption of innocence continues in favor of the defendant throughout each stage of the trial. So he is presumed innocent, and you need to continue that presumption throughout the course of the trial. And you should fit the evidence presented to the presumption that the defendant is innocent if you can reasonably do so. So you should fit the evidence presented to the presumption that the defendant is innocent if you can do so. These are the judges, this is what the judge is going to tell you. These are the jury instructions provided by the court. If the evidence lends itself to two reasonable interpretations, you must choose the interpretation consistent with the defendant's innocence. Again, this is a court instruction. This is the law in Indiana. You are the exclusive judges of the evidence, the credibility of the witnesses, and the weight to be given to the testimony of each of them. So you judge the credibility of Priya. You judge the credibility of Jawan. It's your job to make those determinations. In considering the testimony of any witness, you may take into account his or her ability and opportunity to observe the manner and conduct of the witness while testifying, any interest, bias, or prejudice that the witness may have, any relationship with other witnesses or interested parties, and the reasonableness of the testimony of the witness considered in light of all of the evidence in the case. So it's your job to weigh the credibility of witness testimony in light of all of the evidence in the case. And I encourage you, when you go back to deliberate, review the documents, review the photos, review the summary showing, State's Exhibit 138, review the summary showing that Gregory's DNA is nowhere to be found. I encourage you, please look through the evidence. And as I said, do not let your emotions cloud your judgment in determining that. The only way that you can convict Gregory Robinson is if you trust Priya Witt. And you simply cannot trust her. Jawan didn't trust her. She has motive to lie. She has a reason and bias to lie. So take that into consideration as you're making your decisions. And I'm certain that after you deliberate